My name is Evelyn Hart, and I am 61 years old. For most of my life, I have believed in quiet discipline, saving before spending, listening before speaking, and thinking before reacting. After 4 decades of work as a senior accountant, I was finally approaching retirement. I lived with my husband, Richard, and my 2 adult stepchildren, Megan and Tyler, who came and went from the house more often than I liked, carrying the unmistakable aura of people who believed they were owed comfort without having earned it. The house itself was my sanctuary. A modest, 2-story place with a garden I kept like a small cathedral. Roses in the front, rosemary and sage by the kitchen window, and a quiet bench beneath an old elm tree. I often sat there on Sunday mornings, sipping coffee and listening to the sleepy hum of the neighborhood. For years, I had been the financial backbone of our household. Richard earned decently, but I managed the bills, the mortgage, the insurance, and the savings. None of this bothered me. Responsibility has always been my anchor. But as I approached my 62nd birthday, my company announced an unexpected surprise: employees with over 30 years of service would receive a loyalty bonus. For me, that meant $38,000, a sum large enough to shift the weight of our future. I had plans for that money. Practical, grounded plans. My goal was to make the final payment on the house, clearing the last remnant of debt before retiring. I imagined walking through the front door and knowing, truly knowing, that the home was secure, bought with decades of sweat, worry, and perseverance. I suppose I should have told Richard sooner. But he had a habit of celebrating good news before understanding it. So I waited a few days, thinking of the right moment. Then one evening, while I prepared dinner, I overheard voices drifting from the living room, excited voices, hurried and almost conspiratorial. "Mom's bonus will cover the trip," Megan whispered. "Yeah," Tyler added. "Finally. A full family vacation. Bali is expensive, but with her bonus? Easy." Richard's voice came last, softer but decisive. "She'll be thrilled to contribute." I froze at the kitchen counter, knife suspended over a tomato. My bonus. Contribute. They had plans for my years of loyalty, years they had not worked for, saved for, or sacrificed for. And I had not even told them the amount yet. A quiet chill settled across my chest. Something shifted in me, something small but unmistakable. Because for the first time in a very long time, I felt the first rumble of betrayal. And beneath it, something else. Resolve. I wiped my hands on a towel, stood still for a long moment, and listened as they planned a future they had already taken for granted. They didn't know it yet, but they had just sparked the beginning of something they were not prepared for. Something I had never done before. A slow, ethical, meticulously documented act of reversal. And as I stepped quietly out of the kitchen, I realized something with crystal clarity. If they were planning a trip with my money, then I would be planning something far more permanent. Something they could not undo. Something they would never see coming. I would pay off the property before they ever boarded a plane. And that was only the beginning. I did not confront them that night. I simply finished making dinner, served it, and watched as they laughed and exchanged glances about the trip. None of them looked at me with malice. Instead, they looked at me with something far more dangerous: assumed compliance. Richard described white sand beaches. Megan scrolled through resorts on her phone. Tyler mentioned ATVs and beach bars. They talked as though I had already agreed. As though my labor was theirs to celebrate with. And I sat there quietly, feeling an odd kind of detachment, like I was observing strangers from across a restaurant. After dinner, Richard finally turned to me. "Honey, since you've got that bonus coming, we figured maybe it's time for a big family trip. Something memorable. You know, before you retire." I stared at him. He didn't ask if I wanted to. He didn't ask how much the bonus even was. He didn't ask about the house or my retirement needs. He just assumed. "How much do you need?" I asked softly. "Maybe 25 or 30,000, he said. "We'll know once we book everything." Just like that. As if the number didn't matter. As if all those decades of careful budgeting were simply fuel for their spontaneous joy. I nodded. Not yes, just nodded. And Richard smiled, believing I was on board. But the true shock wasn't the request. It came later that week. A document was left on my desk, a printed itinerary with Megan's handwriting on top. Once you transfer the money, we'll book it. Transfer the money. I stared at the note, my pulse growing slower, heavier. They weren't even pretending anymore. They were treating me like a vessel, a logistical step in their vacation. That was the moment I realized something painful. They hadn't only planned the trip. They had assigned my role in it. The financier. The provider. The silent engine behind their pleasure. The betrayal wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, reasonable sounding, coated in family warmth and expectation. And that made it hurt far more. That night, as I lay awake, the shock hardened into clarity. They didn't think I would ever push back. That belief would become their undoing. I grew up in a household where silence meant survival. My mother believed confrontation created enemies, and my father believed money was a private language spoken only in necessity. I learned early how to stretch a dollar, how to anticipate danger, and how to stay quiet until I understood the terrain. When I met Richard 12 years ago, I thought I was stepping into a calmer life, a life where two adults shared responsibility and lifted each other with balanced support. But slowly, almost invisibly, that balance eroded. Not because Richard was cruel. He wasn't. He was simply accustomed to comfort. His first wife, who passed years before we met, had managed everything for him. And after I entered the picture, I filled the same role with a quiet competence that made it easy for him to forget the effort it required. As for Megan and Tyler, they had been teenagers when I arrived. They didn't resent me, but they never quite accepted me as a parental figure. Instead, I was an auxiliary adult, support staff for their father's stability. Over time, I allowed it. I covered small expenses. Then larger ones. Then emergencies. Then, temporary help that was never repaid. I told myself it was generosity. But in truth, it was habit. The habit of keeping peace. The habit of carrying more than my share because it was easier than saying no. But you can carry weight until one day you feel the muscle tear. And that moment had come. The bonus represented my life's culmination. A final push toward independence, safety, and peace. A chance to close the chapter on decades of labor. Their plans for my money revealed something I had long ignored. They didn't see me as a partner. They saw me as a resource. And resources do not retire. Resources do not get rest. Resources do not get respect. I wasn't angry at them. Not yet. I was angry at myself, for shaping a life where this expectation felt reasonable to them. But clarity, once gained, has a way of igniting resolve. I would reclaim control quietly. Strategically. Ethically. And this time, I would not ask permission. I began gathering information, not dramatic, not invasive, simply the kind of investigation an accountant performs naturally. First, I reviewed our mortgage balance. Only $31,800 remained. The loyalty bonus would cover it entirely, leaving enough for legal fees and a small safety cushion. Second, I reviewed the title documents. The house was in both Richard's and my name, but the mortgage was technically tied to my income. The lender had required my credit score, my employment verification, and my documentation. Without my contributions, the home would never have been approved. Third, I examined our household spending patterns. Over the past 5 years, I had personally covered more than half of the major expenses, repairs, insurance, and medical deductibles. I documented everything. Statements, emails, invoices, and receipts. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. The truth needed structure. It needed detail. It needed evidence that no one could twist into accusation. Then I listened more closely to the conversations around the house. Megan mentioned refundable deposits. Tyler bragged to a friend on the phone that the trip is basically paid for. Richard told his sister that he was finally going to relax with the kids, thanks to Evelyn. They were setting expectations everywhere, public expectations. Expectations that would collapse when the time came. I kept my tone soft, my presence normal, my habits unchanged. I cooked meals, trimmed the garden, helped with minor questions about bills. Every so often, one of them would say something like, "We'll book once you get the funds," and I would simply nod, neither confirming nor denying. Quietly, I arranged a meeting with the mortgage officer. Quietly, I prepared documents for early payoff. Quietly, I requested the formal certificate of satisfaction to be mailed only to me. The dominoes were lining up. Not out of vengefulness, out of balance. Out of justice. One evening, as Megan scrolled through hotel listings, she looked at me with a bright smile. "Mom, you're going to love the villa we found." Mom. She only called me that when she wanted something. I smiled softly, feeling the first quiet spark of certainty. They had written a story where I played a part one had not agreed to. They would soon discover I was writing my own. My bonus arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I received the direct deposit notification during lunch at work. I sat alone in the break room, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of $38,000 settling into my account. A lifetime of effort condensed into a single line of digital text. I didn't rush. I didn't tremble. I simply finished my tea, returned to my desk, and logged into the lender portal. I had all the forms prepared in advance. Within 20 minutes, the request for mortgage payoff was submitted, authorized, and scheduled. The house, my house, would be debt-free by Monday. When I got home that evening, the energy in the living room was electric. Tyler had brochures spread out. Megan had booked trial reservations. Richard approached me with that eager, coaxing smile I had seen many times over our marriage. "So, sweetheart," he began, "the kids found an amazing package deal. If you want to transfer the bonus this week, we can lock everything in." There it was, the assumption in full bloom. I looked at him steadily. "I've used the bonus already." The room fell silent. Richard blinked. Megan froze mid-scroll. Tyler slowly lowered a brochure. "Used it?" Richard repeated. "For what?" I folded my hands calmly. "The mortgage." The silence deepened, thickened, tightened. Megan was the first to speak. "You paid off the house? Without telling us?" I almost smiled. "Without telling us." Richard rubbed his forehead. "Evelyn, we were planning the trip." "I know," I said softly. Their faces shifted, not into anger, but into something more revealing, disbelief. The disbelief of people realizing they had misread a person entirely. Richard's voice carried disappointment, as though I had broken a promise I never made. "We were counting on that money." "No," I corrected gently. "You were assuming it." The truth settled like dust in sunlight, quiet, undeniable. Tyler muttered, "So, the trip's off?" "Yes," I said. The house was the priority. My calmness unsettled them. I could see it. They were expecting guilt, apology, backpedaling. Instead, I offered simple truth. And it shook them. But there was more they didn't yet know. More they needed to understand. And I would deliver it not with fury, but with precision. 2 days later, I invited all three of them to the dining room after dinner. Not for an argument, but for clarity. The table was covered with documents, mortgage statements, expense summaries, household records, and the title history. I sat at the head of the table, posture straight, voice composed. Richard was uneasy. Megan was irritated. Tyler looked defensive. I began calmly. "I want us to go through some numbers together." Megan groaned. "Mom." I raised a hand gently. Let me finish. I showed them the total contributions over the years, mine and Richard's. The repairs I had paid for. The medical bills I had covered. The insurance policies I had managed. The debts I had resolved quietly without burdening anyone. Then I showed them the mortgage approval records, how the lender had required my credit score and my income verification. Had I not been part of the application, the house would not have been approved. I wasn't angry. I was simply laying truth on the table with the measured tone of a professional delivering a financial report. Richard's expression shifted from discomfort to understanding. Megan's irritation shattered into confusion. Tyler's defensiveness deflated. You've done more than we realized, Richard admitted quietly. I nodded. I have. And I never complained. But when I heard you planning to spend my retirement money without asking me, I realized something important. Somewhere along the way, I taught all of you to take my effort for granted. They looked down, the weight of the moment sinking in. Richard spoke softly. We weren't trying to take advantage. I know, I said. But intention isn't the point. Impact is. I straightened the final document, the satisfaction letter from the mortgage lender. This house is now paid off. We own it outright. That means security. Stability. A place that cannot be taken from us. It's what I chose to give this family. Silence. And I expect my decisions about my own earnings to be respected. From this point forward. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary, clear, firm, and long overdue. Richard placed his hand over mine. You're right. We should have asked. Megan looked ashamed. We just assumed you'd want to go. I do want time together, I said gently. But not by sacrificing my future. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with understanding, heavy, uncomfortable understanding. But justice was not only about truth. It was also about consequences. And consequences would follow naturally. The ripple effects began immediately. Richard became more cautious with money, more respectful with questions, more aware of how often he had leaned on my stability without a second thought. It wasn't fear, it was awakening. Megan and Tyler pulled back noticeably. Not out of resentment, but out of recognition. They started handling their own expenses more responsibly. Megan took on extra shifts. Tyler canceled a subscription he relied on me to cover. Small actions, but meaningful. And the trip? It evaporated. Quietly, awkwardly, without confrontation. Their deposits were never finalized, and the brochures disappeared from the living room. No one mentioned Bali again. But the most significant consequence was internal. For the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own household, not a background provider, not the financial engine, but a partner with agency. The house felt different as well. Lighter. Peaceful. Paid-off walls have a serenity that cannot be overstated. Every room echoed with the relief of freedom, freedom from debt, from expectation, from silent obligation. Richard and I had long conversations that we had avoided for years. Real conversations about money, respect, and roles. He apologized more sincerely than I expected, not in a grand gesture, but in small, steady actions. He took over some household expenses. He handled repairs I used to oversee. He asked before assuming. He listened before planning. Revenge, in its ethical form, is not about punishment. It's about recalibration. And that is exactly what unfolded. But there was one final piece left, one final shift inside me that completed the journey. A reflection. A choice. A new rule for the rest of my life. A month after paying off the house, I sat beneath my elm tree, the late afternoon light drifting through the branches. The garden hummed softly with bees. I breathed slowly, deeply, feeling a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. I thought about my life, the decades of work, the habit of silence, the ease with which I allowed myself to become the dependable pillar no one questioned. I thought about Richard, about the children, about how easily families can fall into patterns that shape expectations without malice. But most of all, I thought about the moment I overheard that conversation, the moment that shifted my life. Revenge is not always fire. Sometimes it is clarity, delivered with calm precision. Sometimes it is the quiet act of reclaiming what is yours. Sometimes it is choosing truth over comfort. By redirecting my bonus, I wasn't punishing my family. I was teaching them the truth of my value, of my boundaries, of the weight I carried without complaint. And in the end, they learned. We all did. The mortgage was paid. The house was ours. And for the first time in a long time, so was my voice. I rose from the bench, feeling my age not as a burden but as a badge, a testament to years lived, lessons earned, and strength refined. Before going inside, I paused and reflected on the moral of it all. If you let people assume you will always give, they will forget that giving is a choice. And if you never teach others to respect your boundaries, they will unknowingly walk right over them. I stepped back into the house, the weight gone from my shoulders. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew something with absolute certainty. This was not the story of a stolen vacation. It was the story of a woman reclaiming her life. If you enjoyed this story, tell me, would you have paid off the house, or would you have confronted them sooner?